I have devoted my life to uncovering lost stories, recording hidden histories, and unveiling secrets long forgotten. As a historian and documentary filmmaker, I've spent countless hours traversing old, dusty archives and traveling winding back roads to salvage the events that time might otherwise erase. Over the years, I have garnered a certain reputation for preserving, and sometimes exposing, truths that people prefer to keep in the shadows. My work has taken me across the globe, yet I never expected my next challenge would be found in my own neighborhood. I lived in a seemingly placid community called Havenwood Greens, a neighborhood framed by tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and a quiet pride in its historical significance. Founded in the late 1800s, the area once served as a junction for traveling merchants and pioneer families. Evidence of its heritage remains scattered throughout the district: dilapidated barns, old manor houses, and, crucially, one of the oldest cemeteries in the county, resting near the outskirts of Havenwood Greens. The local homeowners association wielded enormous influence on daily life. If someone's grass got too tall, the HOA noticed. If a mailbox looked slightly askew, they sent warnings. If Christmas lights were left up too long, they'd send irate letters. It was a tightly controlled environment, with the majority of residents grudgingly obeying the regulations, some out of fear, some out of resignation. Within the HOA board, one figure loomed larger and louder than all others: Brenda Karen Pennington. In her early 50s, with a perpetually stern expression, perfectly coiffed hair, and an air of unyielding authority, Brenda Karen Pennington was the self-appointed overseer of Havenwood Green's moral and aesthetic standards. She patrolled the streets daily, notepad and phone in hand, eagerly snapping pictures of perceived rule-breakers. She relished confrontation, elevated her own importance, and dismissed any opinions that conflicted with her own. Over time, her meddlesome behavior felt less like civic duty and more like tyranny. Nobody crossed her. Nobody even dared. Still, the day would come when she'd cross me, and in doing so, she would poke at decades of experience in uncovering secrets and shining public light on dark affairs. Little did she know, she'd chosen the wrong person to bully. My first encounter with Brenda Karen Pennington took place on the day I moved in. My partner and I arrived in a U-Haul, brimming with the typical mix of excitement and apprehension about starting in a new place. As we unloaded boxes, a black SUV coasted up to the curb. Out stepped a woman wearing pressed khaki pants, a stiff white blouse, and large sunglasses that masked her eyes but couldn't hide the contempt in her expression. "Excuse me," she said sharply. "You must be the new homeowners. I'm Brenda Pennington. But you can call me Karen," she added in a strange, forced tone meant to convey humor, but landing somewhere in condescension. "I'm the secretary and the treasurer of the Havenwood Greens Homeowners Association." Then her eyes swept over our driveway, scanning for code violations like a hawk searching for prey. "I do hope you'll respect the neighborhood standards." She abruptly pointed at the truck. "Please let the moving company know they must leave by 6 in the evening. We cannot have large vehicles parked overnight. It disrupts the neighborhood harmony." I tried for a polite smile, despite the fact we'd only arrived that morning. "Of course, we'll unload as quickly as we can." She paused, glanced at me, frowned. "Also, I see that your side hedges are a bit overgrown. The HOA has guidelines about vegetation height. They need trimming within 2 weeks, or you could be fined." She turned to walk away without waiting for a response. "Welcome to Havenwood Greens." As the SUV rumbled off, I let out a breath. My partner placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Wow," they said, summing up in one word the sensation we both felt: unease, discomfort, and the vague notion that we were now living in a tiny kingdom overseen by a rather arrogant queen. Over the next few months, I discovered exactly how total the HOA's power was, and how Karen used that authority to her advantage. She appeared in people's driveways unannounced, scolding them for leaving trash bins out on the curb a few minutes past pickup. She measured the length of grass. She left notes about mailbox color schemes. Every letter ended with her trademark sign-off: "Sincerely, Brenda Karen Pennington, Secretary and Treasurer, Havenwood Greens Homeowners Association." No matter how trivial the transgression, Karen turned it into an opportunity to exert her influence. Others in the neighborhood said little publicly, but behind closed doors, they complained bitterly. Many had tried to stand up to her over the years, only to be drowned out at HOA meetings by her combative style. In time, people simply gave up. They paid their dues, swallowed their frustration, and did their best to stay out of her crosshairs. I kept my distance initially, focusing on turning our new house into a real home. I set up my small library, complete with special shelving for historical diaries and fragile documents I'd gathered over the years. I also arranged the upstairs loft as my personal editing suite for documentary footage. I had just finished a major film on Civil War diaries that had garnered decent national recognition. I was a caretaker of local stories, and I hoped to start a new project soon, something that connected me more intimately with Havenwood Greens. One crisp Saturday morning, I went for a walk across town. The air was light and carried the scent of pine from the nearby forest. I'd read in local brochures that behind a line of twisted oak trees on the outskirts of the subdivision lay a small family cemetery. It was rumored to be one of the earliest in the state, a final resting place for the community's founding families. The moment I learned of it, I felt the old historian's spark ignite. I had to see it for myself. When I arrived, I found a rusty, wrought iron gate with a modest sign that read Havenwood Founders Cemetery. Moss and lichens clung to the tombstones. Many of the stones were battered by time, the inscriptions eroded. Some markers were so worn that only faint outlines of names remained. Others were cracked or partially toppled. Overall, it was in disrepair, clearly neglected. Yet it exuded a solemn dignity. Gazing at the graves, I felt a pull in my chest, the same feeling I always get when I sense an important story waiting to be unearthed. Eager to delve deeper, I asked around town for any historical records about the cemetery. An elderly neighbor, Mrs. Evans, told me that the families resting there were among the first settlers in the region. She recalled hearing that the land had once been part of an old homestead, but after repeated sales, developments, and expansions, it was pinned right on the edge of modern Havenwood Greens. "I remember when I was a child," she said, her voice quavering with nostalgia. "We laid wreaths for the war veterans buried there. But that was a long time ago. Now, the HOA barely even acknowledges its existence." Mrs. Evans wrung her hands as she spoke. "I suspect they prefer not to deal with it. Cemeteries can be expensive to maintain, and the board is all about property values." I felt a surge of curiosity. I decided to check the official records for ownership. Sure enough, the land was designated as a historical landmark, but ironically, it fell under the purview of the HOA for basic upkeep. That fact alone unsettled me, especially because, as I was beginning to see, Karen and her allies rarely took a benign approach to anything that might hamper their idea of an immaculate neighborhood. For weeks, I documented the cemetery in my free time. I photographed each tombstone, took notes, transcribed any legible inscriptions, and tried to piece together genealogical lines. My intention was to create a mini-documentary, or at least an archival record. As I recorded drone footage of the area, carefully abiding by all local regulations, I received my second in-person confrontation with Karen. My drone was in the air for no more than 5 minutes, capturing panoramic shots of the old gate and the stony path leading inside. Suddenly, I heard a woman's furious shriek. Looking away from the screen, I saw Karen stomping across the grassy field like a woman possessed, waving her arms. "You? Stop that. Now." I carefully landed the drone, then turned to face her. She was out of breath and red in the face. "You can't fly a drone over our neighborhood without HOA approval," she spat. I tried to keep my tone calm. "I'm not over the neighborhood itself. I'm filming the historical cemetery. The drone laws in our county allow me to fly up to 400 feet here, as it's not in restricted airspace. I already checked the regulations." She glared, as if personally offended that I had done my homework. "Well, your drone is disturbing the peace. I've had 4 residents call me complaining about suspicious aerial activity. Not to mention, filming is not permitted unless authorized by the HOA board." She jabbed a finger into my chest, not quite touching, but close enough that I recoiled slightly. "You can't be a vigilante historian around here, do you understand?" I arched an eyebrow. "I'm not sure if you're aware, but the cemetery is classified as a historical site. I'm within my rights to film for the sake of documentation, and I'm not intruding on any private yards." Karen's lips tightened. "I'll be discussing this with the board. Expect a formal letter soon." Without further ado, she stomped away, leaving me bristling. Sure enough, a letter arrived 2 days later. It cited a brand new emergency regulation about aerial photography. Supposedly, any drone usage in Havenwood Greens required a permit from the HOA, complete with a $200 processing fee. This blatant overreach was classic Karen. If she couldn't outright stop me, she'd bury me in red tape. I set the letter aside. I'd spent years dealing with bureaucratic archives, museum rules, and every manner of administrative nonsense. One more piece of red tape wasn't going to stop me. Digging further into the cemetery's background, I unearthed a wealth of unexpected information. Through genealogical records, I discovered that many of the families buried there were once prominent landowners. Among them was the Barnett family, for whom a portion of the original farmland was named. They had a direct hand in founding not just Havenwood Greens, but also the neighboring township. The Barnett patriarch served in the Civil War, and at least one of his sons died in the War of 1812. The site was teeming with historical significance, an absolute treasure trove for local heritage. At the county archives, a kindly librarian allowed me into the restricted stacks to view old property deeds. I found references to the cemetery in 1902, when a philanthropic organization wanted to erect a monument to the Barnetts. However, the plan fell through due to a lack of funding. A note scribbled in the margins of a ledger stated, "Possible future development. Land has value." That phrase disturbed me. It suggested that, even over 100 years ago, developers eyed the property for profit. Returning home, I decided to mention my findings to neighbors. Over tea, Mrs. Evans told me, "I've heard rumors for years that the HOA has a plan to expand community amenities. They talk about building a new clubhouse or tennis courts on the outskirts. People wonder if they'll do it where the cemetery stands." "That would be insane," I replied. "It's a protected site." Mrs. Evans gave me a knowing look. "Protected only if people care enough to stop them. Money and power have a way of overriding old tombstones, dear. And Karen has the ear of the entire board." That statement lingered in my mind. Karen's hold over the HOA felt immense, and her personal ambition was no secret. If she truly wanted to develop that land, and if nobody stood in her way, what would become of those graves? One Wednesday evening, I attended an HOA meeting at the local community center. I hadn't been to one before, but after hearing the swirling rumors, I needed to see how decisions were made, and possibly voice my concerns about the cemetery. The room was laid out with folding chairs, half of them empty. At the front sat a long table with the board members. Karen took center, flanked by two other officials, the HOA president, Richard Lowry, and the vice president, an older woman named Harriet. Karen wore a crisp blazer and exuded an air of impatience. She rattled through the agenda, budget approvals, landscaping updates, and so on. People occasionally raised mundane issues, barking dogs, loose trash lids, the usual suburban trifles. Whenever a neighbor complained about the arbitrary rules or the overzealous enforcement, Karen adopted a condescending tone and dismissed them with a wave or a rapid series of pointed retorts. Finally, the floor opened for new business. I stood. "Hello, everyone. My name's _____. I'm new to the neighborhood, and I'm also a historian and documentary filmmaker. I've been looking into the cemetery at the edge of Havenwood Greens, the Founders Cemetery. I'd like to propose forming a volunteer committee to help preserve it, perhaps cleaning it up, setting up historical markers, and—" Karen interrupted abruptly, her voice slicing through the air. "Excuse me, but the cemetery is not under discussion tonight. You may file a motion with the board in writing. We'll review it." I let out a slow breath. I understand. However, I've made some significant discoveries about the historical families buried there, and I believe preserving their legacy benefits all of Havenwood Greens. This area has a unique past, and— Karen's nostrils flared. "The cemetery is an eyesore. Most residents consider it a hazard and want it removed." A wave of nervous murmurs swept the room. A few people glanced at me sympathetically. One older man in the back actually shook his head in disagreement. I tried to remain calm. "It's not merely an eyesore. It's a piece of local history. I'm sure with a little effort, it can be turned into a meaningful site." Richard Lowry, the HOA president, briefly cleared his throat. "Let's consider the possibility that we might use the land for something more beneficial, like a community park or a new rec center. The final decision has not been made." Karen's eyes gleamed. "Yes, a rec center would add tangible value to the area. The cemetery's just a neglected plot that no one visits except for grave robbers and teenage pranksters. My stomach tightened at her callous words. There's real historical value in that piece of land. I've documented families dating back to the War of 1812. Karen shrugged with icy indifference. But does that help our property values? Or does it lower them by reminding potential buyers this land is old and has dead people beneath it? I think we can all guess the answer. Before I could reply, Harriet, the vice president, tapped on the table. Moving on. We'll review any formal proposals at the next session. Karen folded her arms and smirked. Yes. In the meantime, we suggest all members here adhere to the guidelines and watch for the next letter about new compliance measures. A sense of frustration welled up in me. I recognized that Karen and her board allies could bury my suggestions indefinitely or else warp the narrative around the cemetery to push for its destruction. I left the meeting with a sense of urgency. If I wanted to protect Havenwood's history, I'd need a different approach, perhaps one more public. Over the next few weeks, the tension between Karen and me worsened. She became fixated on every tiny aspect of my property, bombarding me with notices and threats of fines. My lawn, which had always been reasonably maintained, now apparently had patches of color variation in direct violation of the HOA's recommended grass type. She took issue with my recycling bins, claiming they were out too early on pickup day. It felt like open harassment, a barrage of petty complaints meant to wear me down. Still, I continued my research. I interviewed the adult children of families who had once lived in Havenwood Greens. They remembered hearing legends about the old Barnett estate, the founding family's orchard, and how the orchard's fruit was once given to traveling poor. I recorded everything meticulously, piece by piece, building a narrative of generosity and solidarity. It became painfully clear that the old culture, one of communal care, had gradually been eroded and replaced by the iron fist of controlling modern HOAs. In passing, I heard that Karen herself had grown up in a nearby city, once served on a different HOA board, and had been essentially run out after too many complaints. She landed in Havenwood Greens about a decade ago, quickly rose to a leadership position, and then consolidated power. Nobody seemed to know exactly why she was so dead set on controlling everyone. Some speculated she found personal validation in it. Others figured she viewed the neighborhood as a stepping stone to bigger political ambitions. Meanwhile, I quietly began filming a short documentary. I recorded footage of the weathered tombstones, the gnarled oak trees, and the hush of the land around them. I interviewed elderly residents, capturing their recollections about those buried there. The story of the founder's cemetery was shaping into a compelling tapestry of history. In my eyes, it could be a source of pride for Havenwood Greens, a testament to the community's roots. One early evening, just after dusk, I was packing away my camera tripod at the cemetery gate when Karen materialized out of the shadows as if conjured by my frustration. She wore a scowl that could curdle milk. "What do you think you're doing?" Her tone was low, dangerous. "Filming," I said. Respectfully, "Karen, the cemetery is a historical site. I'm within my legal rights. You're trespassing. This is HOA property. We have the right to remove anyone on it. Actually, I've already consulted with the county historian's office. They verified that the cemetery is public domain for historical visitation, and it's not privately owned in the conventional sense." She cut me off, stepping closer. "If you continue this nonsense, we'll find a way to deal with you. Don't test me. The board can make your life very, very difficult." I felt a flash of anger, but fought to keep my voice steady. "I'm not looking for trouble. You might consider that preserving this place helps everyone." Karen's eyes narrowed. "You're mistaken if you believe I'd allow a decrepit, worthless graveyard to stand in the way of progress. And I'm telling you, stop filming. Now." With that, she turned on her heel and marched off into the night, her silhouette framed by the glow of a distant street lamp. A chill ran through me. This was no longer a mere feud over lawn care. Karen's hostility hinted at something bigger, a plan she was determined to see through, no matter what it cost. I woke up one Saturday to the sound of heavy machinery. Diesel engines roared. Metal clanged against pavement. My heart lurched as I peered out the window. A caravan of construction vehicles was rolling down the street. Bulldozers, excavators, and dump trucks. They moved toward the outskirts of the neighborhood, toward the cemetery. I threw on clothes and sprinted out the door, adrenaline pounding in my veins. Along the way, I saw concerned neighbors stepping onto their porches, some in pajamas, others in confusion. The HOA, apparently, had not given prior notice about any major project, but the rumble of machines spoke for itself. By the time I reached the cemetery, the vehicles had parked in a cluster. A small crew of construction workers stood around, looking uncertain. Karen was there, barking orders. Her face was set in cold determination. I could see a stack of official-looking papers in her hand, permits of some kind. "What's going on here?" I demanded. I was panting from the run. A faint stench of diesel fuel filled the air. Karen faced me, her voice filled with vindictive triumph. "The HOA has decided to clear the site in preparation for a new community center. We've received the necessary approvals from the board. We're within our rights to demolish the structures here." A jolt of horror shot through me. "There are graves here, people's ancestors. You can't just destroy them." One of the construction foremen stepped forward, looking uneasy. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "the plan calls for exhumations. We're supposed to wait for specialized teams to come in. We can't just start bulldozing grave markers. That's not legal, is it?" Karen glared at him. "We have the necessary documentation. Now get to work. If we need to pay a fine or fill out more paperwork later, we will. But for now, I want everything leveled." I whipped out my phone and began filming. "This is blatant destruction of a historical site," I said, voice trembling with outrage. "You have no idea the trouble you're inviting." Karen's lip curled. "Go ahead, film. You're not the only one with connections. This place is worthless, a nuisance. We're making improvements for the sake of the community." A few neighbors had gathered around, aghast. Some pleaded, "Wait, you need archaeologists, or at least a legal process for removing remains." But Karen brushed them off. She motioned to the bulldozers. "Do it. Now." Under her menacing stare, the construction workers reluctantly started. I watched in horror as one of the bulldozers lurched forward and smashed into the iron gate. Twisted metal screeched. One of the oldest headstones crumbled with a sickening crack. Dust billowed up, and the entire scene felt like a punch to my stomach. A piece of history, quietly resting for centuries, was annihilated in seconds. I kept filming, my hands shaking. The chaos continued. Tombstones toppled, earth churned. Karen's triumphant grin glowed with an unsettling zeal. She had shown the neighborhood, and me, exactly how far she was willing to go. News traveled fast in our modern era. Within hours, photos and videos from neighbors spread through social media. My own footage, the broken stones, the destroyed gate, the swirling dust, reached local historians, journalists, and even a few state officials. A wave of public fury erupted. People couldn't believe an HOA would orchestrate the destruction of a historical cemetery without so much as a formal notice to the community. Local TV stations arrived for interviews. I ended up on the evening news, standing near the wreckage of the cemetery. I spoke about the significance of the Barnett family and other early settlers, referencing the artifacts and genealogies I'd uncovered. Havenwood Green's residents were torn. Many were outraged by Karen's unilateral actions, but a few supporters said, "It's just an old bunch of graves. Let it go." Yet the overwhelming sentiment in the county was indignation. Public officials pledged to investigate whether the HOA had violated preservation laws. The Office of the County's Historical Commission got involved. Meanwhile, Karen seemed strangely confident in her approach, claiming she had legal cover. I had already been developing a mini-documentary, but the events of that Saturday propelled it onto a bigger stage. With the push of a button, I emailed a preview cut and the raw demolition footage to a National Historical Society that had broadcast partnerships. Given my reputation as a historian and documentary maker, along with the shocking nature of the footage, they quickly arranged to feature it in a short segment on a well-known public broadcasting channel. Within a week, the story gained traction across the nation. People were appalled by the wanton destruction of an ancestral cemetery. My phone lit up with calls from genealogical societies wanting more information, newspapers seeking interviews, and outraged local groups who wanted to gather for protests. Meanwhile, Karen's name became synonymous with scandal. Online, she was dubbed the Cemetery Karen. The viral phenomenon ramped up to the point that her face, captured mid-rant in my video, was plastered on social media feeds all over the state, if not the country. Fury boiled over in Havenwood Greens. Neighbors who once endured Karen's tyranny in silence began publicly denouncing her. Petitions circulated to remove her from the board. Even the usually reserved board president, Richard Lowry, tried to distance himself, claiming he had not fully understood the scope of Karen's plan. But the fallout went further. A county official declared an immediate injunction on any further demolition at the site. Investigations ensued, examining whether Karen and the HOA had flouted multiple statutes regarding historical preservation, burial desecration, and environmental regulations. A specialized forensic team was tasked with surveying the extent of the damage, and state law enforcement got involved because desecrating graves can be a serious crime. As media coverage intensified, Karen retreated from the public eye. She refused interviews, except for one disastrous appearance where she attempted to defend her decision. Her statement was rife with condescension. "We live in a modern age. Why keep ourselves mired in the past? I was doing what's best for property values." Public outcry only grew. Behind the scenes, I kept collating evidence. Emails from dismayed neighbors, copies of the questionable permits Karen had signed, and older HOA documents referencing possible expansions. It appeared that for years, Karen had courted private investors to build a large sports complex on the land. The bigger story was that she might have been in line for a kickback or at least recognition once the project launched, fueling her unstoppable drive. One morning, a knock sounded on my door. I opened it to find two men in suits, official badges clipped to their belts. They introduced themselves as investigators with the state's attorney general's office. "Are you the one who documented the demolition? We'd like your footage and any other evidence you have," said the lead investigator. "Yes, I have it all." I guided them to my editing suite. For hours, I played raw footage and turned over copies of emails from the local historical commission. They asked me thorough questions. Did Karen order the demolition personally? Did anyone mention exhuming remains legally beforehand? Did I know of any bribes? In each instance, my evidence painted an incriminating portrait. Karen had orchestrated the event, ignoring not only local rules but state and federal regulations protecting historical graves. When the investigators left, they thanked me gravely. "We expect charges will be forthcoming," one said. "We've never seen an HOA act this brazenly." This might not end well for Ms. Pennington. With the investigation looming, Karen seemed to sense her empire was collapsing. She lashed out publicly, blaming others. She claimed it was the board's collective decision, that unscrupulous contractors had acted prematurely, and that if the demolition had truly broken laws, it must have been due to incompetent legal counsel. No one believed her. Even the board members she once controlled distanced themselves, providing the authorities with internal HOA communications that showed Karen pushing relentlessly for immediate action. Ironically, Karen's longtime tactic, aggression, had left a clear paper trail of her demands. She had emailed instructions to start immediately, no matter who complains. She had threatened any contractors who hesitated. As the weeks passed, more remains came to light in the half-demolished cemetery. The site horrified the county's older families, many of whom had ancestors in those plots. Lawsuits began piling up, directed at Karen and the HOA for emotional distress, violation of state burial laws, and destruction of private property. The situation had escalated into a legal maelstrom that no slick statement could fix. On a windy autumn day, a hush fell over the neighborhood when two sheriff's cars rolled up to Karen's house. Deputies knocked on her door. After a tense few minutes, Karen emerged in a fluster, her face pale with shock. She was handcuffed, then escorted down her manicured walkway as stunned neighbors looked on. The charges included institutional vandalism, destruction of historical property, grave desecration, and more. Combined, they carried heavy potential penalties. Because Karen had orchestrated it in such a blatantly illegal and public manner, the district attorney's office decided to go for maximum sentencing. I watched from across the street, capturing the moment with my camera. Though I felt little sympathy, I did feel a pang of sorrow for our once peaceful neighborhood, dragged into chaos by Karen's reckless ambition. Yet it was also a moment of triumph for historical preservation. The law was finally asserting that some things are beyond the reach of petty power grabs. The media swarmed the county courthouse during Karen's trial. Spectators, journalists, and local residents packed the gallery. Prosecutors meticulously outlined Karen's role in orchestrating the illegal demolition. They called experts to the stand, including archaeologists who explained how remains had been desecrated. Distressed family members testified about the emotional toll of discovering their ancestors' graves ripped apart by machines. Karen's defense tried to argue that she was only following the HOA board's directive, but the paper trail proved otherwise. Emails showed Karen's personal involvement in expediting the demolition. Testimonies from board members pointed squarely at her. The final blow was the raw footage I had captured, Karen commanding bulldozers and brushing off concerns about remains. The judge's expression remained stony throughout those clips. After a long, tense deliberation, the jury found Karen guilty on multiple counts. The judge proceeded to issue a severe punishment, citing the egregious nature of her actions, which disrespected both historical heritage and human remains. On the day of sentencing, a hush fell in the courtroom as the judge reviewed the charges. Ms. Pennington, your blatant disregard for state and federal regulations, coupled with the profound disrespect you have shown to this community, obligate me to impose a sentence commensurate with the harm you have inflicted. You destroyed a piece of American heritage for your own gain and inflicted emotional harm upon those whose relatives lie in the Founders Cemetery. The judge handed down a multi-year prison sentence, citing her leadership role and the orchestrated nature of the crime. Furthermore, the court ruled that her personal property, acquired, in part, through ill-gotten benefits tied to the project, would be forfeited. She was also ordered to pay significant restitution toward the families affected and to fund a portion of the cemetery's restoration. Karen broke down in tears. The once arrogant HOA Karen, who had terrorized neighbors and destroyed a historical site, was led away in shackles. One chapter of her life ended, overshadowed by the harsh reality that her lust for control had cost her everything. When the dust settled, Havenwood Greens breathed a collective sigh of relief. Without Karen's influence, the remaining board members moved to repair community relations. They established a proper historical preservation committee and worked with local historians and descendants of those buried in the Founders Cemetery. A group of volunteers, myself included, devoted time to restoring tombstones, rebuilding the broken gate, and constructing educational plaques about the families who once lived, thrived, and died on that land. The story became an example nationwide of how a determined individual could do great harm if unchecked, but also how communities and justice could rise to confront wrongdoing. My documentary, Havenwood's Legacy, was finally released on a national platform. It showcased both the cemetery's significance and the shocking real-time footage of its near destruction. Public support for preservation grew. Donations poured in to restore other historic sites at risk. For me, personally, the experience reaffirmed why I do what I do. History isn't just about dusty facts and crumbling headstones. It's about remembering that we are all caretakers of the past. Trying to erase or bulldoze it for short-term gain exacts a terrible price. Karen learned that lesson in the hardest, most humiliating way possible, through her own arrest, trial, and punishment. As I strolled through the newly fenced Founders Cemetery months later, the wind gently stirred the leaves of the old oak trees. The graves, now respectfully restored, stood once again as silent witnesses to centuries of life, loss, and continuity. And somewhere, in the quiet breeze, I almost imagined the voices of the Barnett family and other souls, relieved that their resting place was safe at last. Karen, once a symbol of oppressive HOA power, faced the consequences of her reckless ambition. She ended up losing her position, her home, and her freedom. But Havenwood Greens gained a renewed sense of unity, a deeper appreciation for its own history, and a promise that never again would one individual trample the past for selfish gain.